Should you worry about the upcoming changes to the CPI? Answer, no, you shouldn't. Let's go into this. Pretty interesting. I just came across my feed today. CPI calculation to be revised for January price data. I was like, ooh, CPI. Giving back my book on Relax and Retire, debunking the inflation narrative. 147 pages, baby. Look at that. It's soon to be out. I know. I've been promising for 6 months. Look at all these chapters. Oh, you're going to like it. I got my introducing the reality CPI, which is why I should not be worried in the least about this, because this is silly. All right, CPI calculation be revised for January price data. Tobias Burns has written this. The calculation for the consumer price index is going to be updated for January, according to the Labor Department. All right, the new calculation will put more importance on housing sector. Oh, and less on used cars, and will include some methodological whatever changes that could push the headline number higher than economists have been expecting after a year of rapid price changes. A segment of the CPI is called the OER, Owner's Equivalent Rent, which now is more than a quarter of the total calculation of CPI. OER is a clown show. And there's one guy in here who hits it. And if I went that way, I'd ask for that guy's hand in marriage. But I don't go that way because ain't nothing better than a beautiful lady. And I just happen to have the best of the most beautiful ladies as my wife. Look at that. I got the ring to prove it. You might never have seen her on this channel. Maybe you've seen her once or twice, but I could have hired her, some chick off the street. But you don't know, actually, do you now, that I'm actually married to the most beautiful lady that there is. And I just show a ring, you're like, I guess you just got to go on by faith. But anyway, so I'm going to share with this guy who crushes. And I was stunned, actually. I was like, whoa, this guy's speaking my language. Anyway, so a segment of the CPI called Owner's Equivalent Rent will now account for more than a quarter of the total calculation, while housing overall will account for more than 44%. Used car prices have been lowered in importance after a year which wholesale and retail car prices fell out of sync with each other. Weights are going to be updated annually now in the Labor Department's calculations. How do they update them? Do you know how they update them? Using the Consumer Expenditure Survey from the BLS. All right. So they literally look at what people spent their money on, and that's how they weight the CPI. And Pablo doesn't. Come on, hold on a second. Pablo wants to jump on board here. There we go. All right. Let me go back here. Hold on a second. All right. Economists are expecting CPI to go up by 0.5 point from December of 2022 to January 2023. Annual CPI is expected to fall from 6.5 to 6.2, according to Bloomberg consensus estimates. All right. Economists have some concern with the updated measurements. You think? Here's a professor of economics at the University of California. He said, my wife just texted me. There's a lag, but there's a lag when the basket is measured and when it actually gets used in the CPI. 100%. That's exactly right. Because remember, what they're doing is they're basically what they've done before is they're taking the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey over 2 years previously and using the weights based on that. The Consumer Expenditure Survey is what they use to determine what you spend your money on. All right, it's just that simple, man. And then they're weighting it based on that, and that would seem reasonable, except for this thing called OER. It's so stupid, it really is. For example, the weights they're using this year are based on consumer patterns from 2021. This does raise some issues that maybe household spending patterns in 2021 were unusual because of the pandemic. The importance of owners. Now here's my man right here, Paul Donovan. Well, he's Irish, so he knows he's got to be all right. He's probably drunk. He's an Irishman, drunk with a green. Pinch me, I'm Irish. It's a joke, people. Get the stick out of your butt and relax. It's a joke. Drunken Irishman, you never heard that terminology? Drunken sailor, you never heard that terminology? Look, I wasn't a sailor. I was in the infantry. So if you take, given that I'm somewhat Irish, half Irish, I guess, who knows? I'm just a Northern European mutt. But anyway, so given I'm German and Irish, there's a lot of drunkenness on my family. And the fact that everyone in my family, except for me, was in the Navy, goes hand in hand. Drunken sailors, drunken Irishmen with the Germans who love their, Germans are known to be drinking too, if memory serves. Yeah, I think they do. Oh, boy. Anyway, so people got to stick up their butt. I can't laugh. Anyway, right here. The importance of owner's equivalent rent has increased, which may raise the CPI in the near term and lower them long term, says UBS analyst Paul Donovan. Owner's equivalent rent is a fantasy price no one pays. It's loosely linked to market rents with a lag, and so is expected to be disinflationary later this year, but currently adding to inflation. It's worth remembering that while markets may get worked up about the effect of consumer prices, these moves have no impact on consumer spending power because it's a fantasy price. That is literally verbatim out of this guy's mouth. Not literally, rhetorically. Owner's equivalent rent is a fantasy price no one pays. These moves have no impact on consumer spending power because it is a fantasy price. What is owner's equivalent rent? So let's go to my book and we'll talk about it. I got a whole chapter dedicated to owner's equivalent rent. The BLS data from August 2022 is in the table below. You'll notice that the shelter now represents 32.4% of the total weight of the CPI. So if CPI went up by 10, let's just CPI went up by 10. Well, that's not the right thing. That's not the right term. It's CPI. Anyway, of the CPI, however they're measuring it, a third of it is attributed to shelter. I guess you could say if CPI went up by 10, a third of that is attributed to increasing in shelter. All right. If nearly a third of the totality of inflation is attributed to the change in shelter costs, isn't it then logical to know how shelter is defined? Of course it is. So we get that shelter is divided into two things. Rent of primary residence is 7% of the 32%, and owner's equivalent rent is right there. And what is 24%. So shelter is a third of the entirety of CPI, of which rent is 7% of that third. Or I guess, whatever, 7% of that is 32%. Anyway, and owner's equivalent rent is 24% of the entirety of CPI. And going back to that article right there, they said owner's equivalent rent, will amount to more than a quarter of the calculation. So here's 23.87. Now it's going to be more than a quarter. Rent of primary residence is pretty simple to understand. But what the heck is OER? The expenditure weight in the CPI market basket for OER is based on the following question that Consumer Expenditure Survey asks of consumers who own their primary residence. If someone were to rent your home today, how much do you think it would rent monthly unfurnished and without utilities? Huh? If someone, I gotta make that blue. If I own my home today, how much would it cost to rent if I were to rent it out, unfurnished, without utilities? That is part of the CPI. I don't know because I don't plan on renting it out. Well, just put it in there anyway, Josh. Okay, $3,000 a month. There you go. That's what OER is, and it's a quarter of the entirety of CPI. You can read the definition and justification of OER, but if you're so inclined, but remember what the CPI is supposed to do. The objective of the Consumer Price Index is to measure the change in expenditures required to maintain a given standard of living. So how the hell, pardon my French, would asking me if someone were to rent my home today, how much would it rent for? Does that measure the change in expenditures required to maintain a standard of living? It makes sense that inflation measurement, we should track the changes in price of goods. Americans regularly buy in order to see how much it costs to maintain a given standard of living. But then the BLS throws this into the mix. For expenditures on houses, this leads to a measurement objective that focuses on the shelter services provided by a house over time. A house is a capital asset that provides a flow of services over time, a substantial period over time, not a one-time consumption item. Your house is a capital asset. Remember that as we move forward. The BLS explored two major approaches to determine how to estimate the cost of shelter services for an owner-occupied dwelling. The first approach attempts to estimate the flow of shelter services for an owned dwelling from items related to living in it. This approach is called user cost and includes items such as real estate taxes. That makes sense. Insurance makes sense. And interest estimate based on the market value of the house. I want to paint the picture from the BLS's perspective on how to measure housing in the CPI. They acknowledge your house is a capital asset and not an expense item that is purchased on a regular basis. Your house does have regular costs that the BLS calls user costs, and they are a regular expense item which should be measured as part of CPI. These costs should be included in CPI because they incur regularly. But that's not what the BLS chose as their measurement for housing costs. They chose the second approach. The second approach attempts to estimate the flow of services for an owner dwelling based on market rents for rented dwelling. This research led to a method referred to as rental equivalence. This method measures the rate of change in the amount an owner would need to pay in order to rent on the open market. It's so freaking stupid. The amount an owner, you own your house, you need to pay to rent your own house on the open market. That's freaking dumb, dude. That's dumb. And then on top of that, they're including this here too, rent of primary residence. I don't rent, and I'm not going to rent. So a third right there of the whole CPI is just stupid. It's stupid. And yet people are going to use CPI as their projections for retirement expenditures? What the hell, dude? Anyway, that's what my whole book is focused on. It's nuts. And I actually, I'll share with you real quick. Just say no to these inflation components. Again, shelter, rent of primary residence, owner's equivalent rent, transportation, new and used motor vehicles, 17.4%. The purchase of a new or used motor vehicle is 9%. I haven't bought a new car. Again, buying a car is a capital asset. It should be reflected on the balance sheet. And if you're taking a loan for that capital asset, it should be reflected on the income statement. I talked about that actually. I talk about the, I'm not going to get to it. Anyway, so then I say you're introducing the reality CPI. And we look at, instead of using housing, your overall housing is almost a half of total CPI. We use 10%. Now you see a significant jump from what we use if we make it right there. So we're increasing our CPI. And maybe I'll do a different video on this actually, because this is the reality CPI. Reducing transportation costs, increasing medical costs, increasing recreation, increasing education, and increasing food and beverages by twice. The reason we're getting away with that, frankly, is because we use reality CPI, which is based on your day-to-day expenditures to maintain your standard of living. The CPI doesn't do that. The CPI, when they're using owner equivalent rent or rent of primary residence, I don't rent, so why the hell do I need to rent of primary residence in my own CPI calculations? It's stupid. I don't plan on renting my own home to myself. Why would I use OER as part of my CPI calculations? It's stupid. Now I do have property taxes. What I'm saying, I do have homeowners insurance, and trust me, I just freaking paid USA. It ain't cheap. Those are cash flow items. They go on the income statement. The income statement would determine the things you buy, and that's what CPI should measure. They shouldn't measure capital assets. Now I talk about my book, so I need to get working on that. Love your thoughts. We'll see you.